Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I want to continue the library tour with a trip over to these pesky penguin classics, specifically those with the little red color bar on the spine. Now, I shared in an earlier video that the color bar was used by Penguin to denote the language a work was originally published in, with the red bar indicating works that were originally published in English. We're going to see that that's a bit of a stretch with a couple of these volumes, but there's some really good books in here. The other thing I want to note is that in the final third of the 20th century that Penguin was producing this type of edition, they were also producing a Penguin 20th Century Classics lineup that had the mint green spines. I showed those in an earlier video. So there's a number of novelists from the 20th century whose works don't ever end up with an edition like this. All of those, 20th century and these ones, ended up being converted to sort of the classic black spine lineup that we think of more recently. So writers like D.H. Lawrence, Iris Murdoch, James Joyce, Graham Greene, John Steinbeck, all of those really had their works published in the mint green spine lineup. Ironically, Henry James managed to achieve his lifelong goal of being grouped with the Victorians and did have these. I won't be showing any of them. But we'll start off with the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. Dickens before he was Dickens. Dickens really as he became Dickens, his first great sort of masterpiece. Now, this is a book that I think surprises some readers. It's a very early novel from Dickens. It is long and has all sorts of, his great trademark humor and whimsy and silly, zany characterizations that all work incredibly well. It does not have the architecture that we see in Bleak House, or the real sense of clear focus that we see in something like Great Expectations. So it can feel, I think, a little strange for readers who come to it. I don't hear very many people discussing this book in the same breath as they do even works like Oliver Twist or A Tale of Two Cities, which I think are not as strong as Pickwick Papers. But it's very goofy. It can be a bit of a baggy novel because there's just a lot going on, and there doesn't seem to be an obvious, clear through-line narrative plot or theme running through it. And that's kind of what makes it fun, is there's this real sense of zest to the Pickwick Papers. So I've enjoyed this. Then I have Anthony Hope, The Prisoner of Zenda and Rupert of Hensel, and this is a still from the great 30s film adaptation with Douglas Fairbanks Jr. as Rupert of Hensel and Ronald Colman as the pretend king. And so this is a really cool, sort of Victorian, the last gasp of Victorian gentleman novels, where we have an English, gentleman. He's over in Central Europe somewhere, the mythical Ruritania, and he just happens to look exactly like the crown prince of that area. And when it turns out that the crown prince has been, subdued and captured in a plot, well, every gentleman must do his duty. And so the lookalike ends up going to the coronation and, working with the members of the government who are loyal to that clownish crown prince who's quite unsuccessful. And then ultimately having to do battle to rescue that, correct heir, and have to duel the great Rupert of Hensel, the deadliest of the various villains in the book. It's a triumphant, exciting, picaresque novel. Rupert of Hensel then is a sequel, never was filmed as far as I know. The Prisoner of Zenda was filmed a few times. Rupert of Hensel was never filmed. It's much darker and deals with sort of not a comeuppance, but this sense that the evil that was vanquished was defeated but not for permanently vanquished does come back, and in frightening ways. So it's certainly an effective book. There you go. It was also the basis for George MacDonald Fraser's, The Prisoner of Zenda was the basis for George MacDonald Fraser's second Flashman adventure, Royal Flash. Here we have Three Men in a Boat and Three Men on a Bummel by Jerome K. Jerome. Three Men in a Boat is absolutely hilarious. It's a group of friends who basically decide they're going to take a boating trip, and what an absolute clownish disaster it is for all of them. Three Men on a Bummel has them then getting back together for what is it, a bike ride, I believe. Bicycle tour through Europe, through Germany. So this one's fun. This was originally published right at the beginning, I want to say, of the 20th century. Let's see. Yeah. So yeah, Three Men on a Bummel was 1900. Right before the 20th century, was Three Men on a Boat. This is a very funny book. Mark from Book Time at Elvis absolutely loves it. Now, I said there was a stretch. Here's the first stretch, the earliest English poems. This is a collection of Anglo-Saxon poetry, Old English. from 700 to 1000 of the Common Era. So that means there's a translator by Michael Alexander. These are interesting. They're not masterpieces of poetry. We have The Wanderer, we have The Seafarer, we have a number of shorter poems, we have some riddles from Anglo-Saxon. The big ones are, was The Death of the Rood? Dream of the Rood. The Dream of the Rood, which is this longer poem that's very religious, very focused, and then an excerpt from the Battle of Maldon. Which is a sort of great Anglo-Saxon poem around a battle. So those are the two real, like, sort of, you know, gems that are within this. But there are other works that are interesting. It's also interesting to note that Anglo-Saxon poetry did not have what we think of as sort of the sing-song rhyme and rhythm that we think of within later Middle English poetry, late Middle English poetry, or certainly the Elizabethan Jacobean poetry when we think of Shakespeare and the playwrights and poets who are writing around him, or Milton with Paradise Lost. Here, it's all about stress. It's about the way the balance of the line works, and so it's very different. It can be very different to read and to sort of get this like push and pull almost dynamic within the poetry. But these can be interesting. I'd be curious to know if anybody else has read this volume. Maybe you are a huge fan of The Wanderer. Another volume of poetry, Ben Jonson, The Complete Poems. Note this is the poems, not the plays or the masques. But Ben Jonson was a surprisingly successful lyricist. A number of these are epigrams or dedication poems. Then we have The Forest. The Forest is a very solid work. And Eupheme, which is a series of poems. So these point to the Ben Jonson who is sort of a leader among the school of Ben, not just within his dramas, Volpone, The Alchemist, other works like that, or into the masques he would create for courtly banquets and such. But this is Ben Jonson the poet, and this is a different person than we see, I think, in those other works. And so I have enjoyed this side of Jonson more so than I have probably enjoyed his drama. Another cool one, Christopher Smart selected poems. Smart is writing later on. We're now in the 18th century, right in the middle of the 18th century, really. And Christopher Smart, this is, I believe, his portrait of him as a student, I believe. But Smart is sort of a tragic figure. He suffered from mental illness, and he was confined to an asylum at times, in a time when that was not a mental health institution. It was a prison. And so from there, he writes poems, some of which are incredibly haunting. The Jubilate Agno is incredibly, incredibly haunting to realize the context. In it, he has these lines in which he's speaking about meditating on his cat. I will consider my cat Geoffrey. And he lists these things that he does. And in this way where he is imitating aspects of the Psalms, because a number of these poems are translations into English of the Hebrew Psalms. And Smart is tapping into that strain of poetry, but he's doing it about objects on earth that almost never receive that type of poetic treatment, particularly in the European tradition. It happens elsewhere in the world. And so Smart taps into that, but his Song to David is in here and some other works. I find him to be a very strong, beautiful poet, personally. We have some drama. Thomas Middleton, 5 plays. These are really bloody plays. Trick to Catch the Old One, The Revenger's Tragedy, A Chaste Maid in Cheapside, Women Beware Women, and The Changeling. Now, there is some comedy in here. But The Revenger's Tragedy is probably what Middleton is still best known for, and that is just this incredibly vicious play. And it's almost strange to believe that the man who was capable of taking Seneca and being inspired, if that's the right word, to create The Revenger's Tragedy was also then writing these sort of comedies focused on love in Women Beware Women or The Changeling. So again, curious to know if anybody really is a huge Middleton fan out there. The other big stretch that I have, Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, originally titled the Historia Regum Britanniae. That's Latin, which means that this is also a translation, yet it gets a red bar. So there were a couple of stretches of works that were English works that had been translated into English. And so Geoffrey Monmouth ends up in here. This is not the most wonderful history. It is at times part myth, part adventure. We get the founding of Britain. We get little snippets of, King Cole. We get Cymbeline, which would become sort of the character names and a strand in the play by Shakespeare, the late play by Shakespeare. And then, of course, we get Arthur at the end. This is from the 12th century, and so we're a little bit closer to any historical King Arthur, such that he may have been. But again, with this work, we're at about the distance from a historical Arthur to the creation of this, as, for example, the Saga of the Volsungs is from the 5th century of the Common Era up to the 11th, 12th, 13th century when it's being written down as a work. So we have that type of distance going on here, and perhaps this Arthur really existed. Geoffrey certainly, I think, wished he would have. It would have been pretty cool. He also did battle with an Emperor Lucius, which is news to me. Another work, mostly nonfiction, selected writings from Samuel Jonson. We have writings from the Idler and the Rambler. We have portions from the Lives of the Poets, the Vanity of Human Wishes, sections from the Dictionary, essays from the Adventurer as well. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, Jonson has some interesting entries into here, but overall his sensibilities are pretty intense and pretty intensely negative. Boswell's Life of Jonson produces a much funnier version of Jonson than Jonson himself is in these pages. So I'll just add that. And then finally, The Mountains of California from John Muir. And here we can see the beautiful mountains there. Muir, I have a number of his writings in another series, but this is the one I have from Penguin Classics, The Mountains of California. And here he goes into just appreciating the mountains, more so than going into a specific mountain or a specific valley, the way he did in a number of his other works, or a specific like season or experience that he had. Here it's a little bit more expansive, and so that I enjoyed. There you go. So these were Penguin Classics with Red Spines. Let me know what your favorites are from these or from your own libraries of Penguin Classics Red Spines. I'll see everybody later.